Now, without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker. We have Mathijs King from Cambridge University. Take it away, Mathijs.
Yeah, so normative models in social epistemology. This is going to be a fairly discursive and kind of loose presentation. I'm not going to try and take you through any kind of particularly technical argument. I don't think it's a super complex idea either. It's just trying to bring in a slightly different angle, in particular a kind of historical angle to some of the questions in the major debates around normative models and philosophy of science. So to sketch the plan for the talk, it's basically I'll go into the background a bit, just because I'm going to assume that people don't have any kind of specific knowledge of this topic or of the models I'm talking about. Some of you may be far more well versed than I am in some of these models, but for the sake of the talk, I'll just assume that people don't know the details. So the first step will be to talk about Philip Kitcher's work. Some of you may have heard of Philip Kitcher. He's a pretty big name in philosophy of science, but some of his most pioneering work was in introducing formal modeling techniques to social epistemology. So I'll go over his work and the kind of tradition that's he's brought about, him and a few other individuals like Alvin Goldman, and some of the major kind of debates that have emerged in response to these models, and how that's kind of how my argument is supposed to contribute to those debates. Then I will cover my argument itself, the actual meat of the argument, if you like, which revolves around a shift in perspective from talking about the accuracy of a model, the kind of representational and predictive accuracy that has traditionally been the focus of a lot of the discussions around these models. A shift from that to looking at the purposes of these models. Why were they introduced? What were they supposed to achieve? And how does the purpose inform the modeling choices that were made? And how does that purpose impact our assessment of these models, our understanding of their epistemic function? I'll then consider a particular objection, a sort of general objection regarding the move from the context in which these models were first introduced to the contemporary situation in modeling, based on my sort of fairly kind of made up notion of formal internalism. And then I'll move to the conclusions and attempt to kind of push back against that objection. And yeah, hopefully there'll be some time for questions. So a bit of background, for anyone who doesn't know what social epistemology is, it's involved essentially in investigating the epistemic effects of social interactions and social systems. So a move away from the kind of traditional approach that epistemology in philosophy has been occupied with for a long time, which is generally characterized by a focus on the individual knower, the kind of Cartesian subject in a fairly isolated and abstracted kind of frame. What can you do to gain knowledge of the world? How do you overcome skepticism and doubt and all the various associated questions? A move away from that towards a social framework where we look at multiple knowers or inquirers investigating the world, in the case of science, and how the fact of that social system, the interactions between individuals, affects all of the various questions around epistemology, how knowledge is exchanged and produced, and how the structure and organization of a social system impacts the production of knowledge, basically. So Philip Kitcher, with the division of cognitive labor, made a big step here. He was the first, pretty much, to use economic models, basically, to to approach some of these questions. And his main step was to say, look, one of the troubles with looking at epistemology in a social sense, in a social frame, is that there seems to be a bit of a conflict between what it's rational for an individual to do and what it's rational for the whole collective to do, a whole group of scientists. And his example was based on the notion of, let's say there's a particular scientific problem that we all want to solve, sequencing the human genome, for example. There's one answer to it, and we all just want to get to the answer as quickly as possible. There's a big group of us, and we can all pick a different, from a list of different experimental or theoretical approaches to this problem. How best do we organize a group of people to go about discovering the answer? And he wanted to show that, contrary to what we might think, understanding scientists as being self-interested in their work rather than disinterested truth seekers is actually better for science as a collective than if we try and maintain that scientists are only interested in epistemic returns, rather than a more nuanced view that incorporates the fact that scientists are people like all of us, and they have personal interests, they want their career to progress. And the way he worked this out with an economic model was by saying, well, look, imagine if we have a list of different methods that we could pick between. If we all just went on the basis of an epistemic assessment that said, look, what's the most likely method to get me to the right answer, then we would have an entire collective which they all put their eggs in one basket. Basically, look, we all roughly agree these one or two methods look like the most likely, and therefore, if we all get behind this, that's what's going to get us the right answer, because each individual is going to do that. But he said, no, what happens if we assume self-interest on the basis of you getting reward based on your contribution and the novelty of a discovery, we can see that if I see everyone else going after that one theory, I'm probably going to pick a different theory on the basis of my self-interest that may be less likely to be true, but if it is true, my contribution will be much more significant because there's no one else working on this particular method. So if that's true, we can see that the collective trend is going to be that you have a distribution that's much more even of scientists working on their different problems, each of them thinking, well, this is a good chance for me to get ahead if this works out. So his conclusion was that basically self-interest in an economic sense actually works out well for the collective. And those of you familiar with philosophy of economics or economics in general will recognize that this is essentially a rehashed invisible hand argument that says economic self-interest at the level of the individual actually propagates in a collective to producing socially optimal distribution. That was the essential thrust of his argument. He used some neoclassical macroeconomic modeling to show what he wanted to show. And it spawned a tradition of normative models that were interested in deriving some conclusions about how best to organize science. So it was generally speaking, the background is that the idea is we can get information from this about how we might actually organize science in the real world, science policy, basically. So generally the debates around this topic have focused on whether these assumptions, this model imported from neoclassical microeconomics is realistic, whether that's a fair portrayal of scientists or the scientific research process, and a more general critique that has developed that's probably familiar to many of you regarding the scientific status of economics itself. There's obviously a big tradition in philosophy of economics involved in discussing the merit and epistemic function of highly idealized models of social systems. But generally these criticisms have resulted in a proliferation of different, more nuanced and more advanced modeling techniques that seek to better represent scientific agents and their interactions, drawing on a range of different sciences: management science, organization, artificial intelligence, ecology, a whole range of different simulation techniques and computer modeling has been kind of drafted in to provide different models in response to some of the criticisms that Kitcher's economic models were a bit too simple. So that's kind of the setup. I mean, a lot of my thinking was prompted by a paper, a very recent paper by Idinonat, Regula, and Ilikoski about argumentative landscapes. The general thrust of their paper was to say, look, all this discussion about accuracy of models and the kind of realisticness of the assumptions on which they're based is kind of missing the point. And they're referring to a lot of the more recent debates which try and say, look, these models are not calibrated with real empirical data. They don't represent accurately or in a way that's predictively useful for the scientific community. And therefore, we shouldn't be drawing the kind of conclusions that we are, the normative conclusions about how to organize science. Now, these guys respond to that by saying, look, we're missing the point by saying that. This focus on what they call the model target dyad, namely the relationship between the target system, which is, you know, a community of scientists, and the model is lacking or is insufficiently fleshed out. So the relationship between your modeling and your assumptions, the idealized system and the real system, is usually what's been kind of criticized, that relationship. And they say that misses the point. You have to take into account the broader argumentative context and the purposes of these models. And they quite convincingly, by appealing to various other long traditions of modeling debates in philosophy, that the problem is that the inaccuracy of the model is kind of crucial. It's fundamental. It's necessary in order to make the model tractable, in order to make the model a useful way of exploring possibilities, rather than something that's supposed to be, a highly accurate representative kind of representation, if you like, of the scientific community. So that's their take. So now we're going to get to my argument, right? And my argument involves basically saying, look, if they're right, that the context, the argumentative context, and the modeling purposes are important when we're understanding these formal models, then let's look at the argumentative context and the purposes. Let's go back to Kitcher and Goldman in the 90s and see what were the reasons, what was the work that these models were doing for them, why did they introduce them, and that can help us understand how to assess their epistemic contribution, basically. And to give a bit of a broader background, a very quick sketch, I think we can usefully go back to Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions as one of the major kind of influential openings. He opened a door in the view of many historians of science, sociologists of science, and philosophers of science into understanding and looking at the scientific community as one of the factors in the way science develops. And not just that, but social, historical, and political contexts. Now, the way the more radical sociologists and historians interpreted Kuhn was not necessarily to Kuhn's liking. He disagreed that, as some of them were arguing in his wake, science was not the purely independent and rational, objective discovery of truth, but was actually heavily influenced, shaped by social and political contexts. There's obviously been a big tradition in philosophy that is worried about the relativism that ensues from that kind of position, in the sense of, if science is not this independent and objective truth-finding method, then its epistemic authority is under threat. And that was the impression around this time in the 90s, that there was a series of mounting attacks on the kind of classical view in philosophy of science as independent of the wider society in various general senses, and the kind of associated position of scientific realism and rationalism. So in that context, this statement from a paper by Uskali-Mekki in 2005, I think captures roughly what's going on here. So in contrast to constructivist and relativist sociology of scientific knowledge, economic accounts of science seek to provide a rigorous defense of the cultural and epistemic legitimacy of science by accommodating plausible elements in the sociological accounts and by embedding them in visible hand arguments about the functioning of some market-like structure within science. Okay, that's a lot. Let's like unpack that a little bit. In contrast to constructivist and relativist sociology of scientific knowledge. So that's kind of where the attack is coming from, that Kitcher and Goldman and the like are responding to by introducing economic models in order to provide a rigorous defense of the cultural and epistemic legitimacy of science. So they're looking to shore up the epistemic authority. Like, look, science, just because you say agents are interested and they're partial and they are imperfect and they are not disinterested truth seekers, they have interests, they can be influenced, they have economic self-interest, all that stuff. They accommodate a plausible elements of those sociological accounts and embed them in invisible hand arguments. So the idea is roughly in the tradition of to some extent Robert Merton, but also Michael Polanyi, to propose elements of market-like structure in science. Science is a bit like a market in some way, and they can do that in order to kind of salvage, as Philip Kitcher's model shows, that actually these self-interested notions of what scientists are like are good for science in an epistemic way, not bad like people, contrary to one's assumptions, this is actually good for science. That's the rough structure of these arguments. So they're introducing these models to perform a bit of work in an argument that tries to defend the objectivity of scientific knowledge on account of the actually useful purposes that these slightly different, more critical accounts of scientific agents, result in a social epistemic framework. So what is my argument here? Well, I'm basically taking this and saying the fact that the purposes were there for Kitcher and Goldman and others these purposes informed directly the modeling choices they made and the roles, obviously, that the model plays in their arguments. So the idea is, once we know that that's the work that the model is doing, we can better understand what the contribution of these models is. And we can say, look, it makes sense that an economic model, or any mathematical model, I suppose, but it's more obvious in the case of economics. It makes sense that an economic model is going to be able to do that work for them because they focus entirely on the internal structure of science, right? The way science is organized internally, the way communication happens between individuals, the different options an individual has when it comes to selecting methods or being flexible between different methods, or which pieces of background theory they use to inform an experimental technique, so on and so on and so on. So the methodology, rather than being realized as explicit commitments in their arguments, their defense, the normative intentions of the models were realized in the form of the models themselves, right? In the actual modeling assumptions, in the introduction of formalisms into the philosophical argument. That's what carries these normative commitments to the position, the kind of classical position, right, of scientific objectivity. So I've called that I've sketched that approach, called it formal internalism, namely the idea that what social epistemology should be concerned with and what normative claims should, involve reference to is basically just the internal structure of science. Its organizational structure, the way, the composition, the diversity of problem-solving methods, those kinds of things. And we can see that that does a certain kind of work in the fact that it specifically excludes certain other factors from being involved in the process of epistemic inquiry. So agenda setting by certain external influences, or the actual social and political and economic determinations of the institutions, experimental techniques, resources. Those factors are avoided in favor of focusing internally on how the structure of inquiry affects the epistemic outcome. So that's roughly the idea. To put it another way, from the outset, the formal modeling approach was developed with normative commitments in mind, right? Rather than being stated as explicit premises or conclusions to be argued for, these commitments were realized in the form of the modeling approach itself. The development of a central focus on the division of labor and the competitive interactions between scientists as the mechanisms with which social epistemology should be concerned. So that emphasizes the independence of the scientific knowledge that we end up with from any of the forces or factors that are external to the epistemic community. That's the basic gist of what I'm saying. And so we've now reached the objection part. I haven't got long left, so I'll try and keep it fairly brief. An obvious immediate objection is going to be, look, that's all well and good for Goldman and Kitchers and others, kind of simplistic economic models. That may be true of them, but our contemporary modeling techniques are a lot better. You know, they're more nuanced. They allow for a much more complex and perhaps accurate representation of the scientific community. And in particular, the move towards agent-based modeling has been very, very productive for a lot of these kind of domains of social epistemology. One example is Weisberg and Muldoon's epistemic landscapes model. Here we can see a little graphic from it where the location on the plane in the, I suppose you'd say the X and Z directions along the gray part represent the problem choice. If you imagine it like a map of possible scientific problems to investigate. And then the height on the y-axis, the depth of the troughs and the height of the mountains, if you like, represent this epistemic significance of the discoveries or the research that will result. Now, it's true, absolutely, that these models are better. So I'm not trying to say that all social epistemic modeling or all formal modeling in philosophy is somehow suspect because of these particular models in the 90s that were introduced for a particular purpose. However, what I do think is relevant is that most of the contemporary social epistemology formal models directly avow, if you like, their continuity with Kitcher's project. So they accept most of the basic assumptions of his approach and simply try and improve on the modeling tools and the diversity of different results that they can generate using their models. So it's true that the models are better, but it isn't necessarily true that the normative commitments and the image of science that those normative commitments are based on isn't still being carried forward along with most of these models. I'm not saying that these contemporary philosophers are explicitly still trying to defend, the absolute incontrovertibility of scientific knowledge, but they do adopt a certain modeling approach which contains, or rather which is based on an image of science. And that image of science, although I'm not trying to argue for or against the image of science, I'm just trying to say we should make explicit the normative commitments and intentions which underpin that image of science. We should be going into this with, eyes fully open about the traditions that inform certain techniques and the role that that plays in the modeling choices and assumptions, and particularly the focus that that kind of stresses, right? The result is a tendency to focus on internal structure at the expense, perhaps, of incorporating discussions of the external influences which shape scientific research today. And this is probably in part, representing my own research interests as well, where, aside from this topic, I've generally tended to focus on 20th century history of various policy relevant sciences in the United States, like the food industry and their involvement in nutrition science, the tobacco industry's involvement in medical science, the fossil fuel industry's involvement in chemical engineering and climate science. In those cases, it's very clear that broader and less formally representable factors are playing a serious epistemic role in the knowledge that science is producing. And that's evidenced just by everyone's kind of familiarity with the truth of those industries' influences, their ability to shape elements of the scientific agenda, and how that impacts the knowledge that is able to then generate policy. So, in the case of these contemporary models, we still see that essentially the tenets of the formal modeling approach involve objectivizing, if you like, something like epistemic significance in the case of an epistemic landscape, such that we treat the crests and dips in those on that graph as already given to us, and we just have to figure out the best method for finding them, rather than incorporating some of the more developed developments, some of the more developed ideas from social and historical critiques, which show the kind of two-way interaction between epistemic significance and the wider society. So just to kind of reiterate that this concern is still there for the modelers themselves. Patrick Grimm still kind of feels the presence of this, what he calls postmodern philosophy of science, in a way that again distinguishes it from much postmodern philosophy of science. This work he's referring to, the kind of contemporary computer computational modeling tradition, is distinctly realist rather than social constructivist or anti-realist in character. The central question being explored is one of optimal investigatory structure. What pattern of scientific communication and cooperation between what kinds of investigators is best positioned to lead us to truth? So here you can see that it's still there. It's still there, right? This concern with, as he puts it, postmodern philosophy of science, and he means social constructivism and relativism. So that's still being pushed back against in a contemporary context, and shows that the realist, if you come to it from an already realist point of view, you're going to be able to say, therefore, all I care about, since I already know scientific truth is out there and real and objective, all I care about is the optimal investigatory structure. And in the process, we lose the ability to effectively incorporate some of the other social developments in social philosophy, like feminist philosophy of science, standpoint epistemology, sociology of scientific knowledge, those elements which I think do have something to say about the way science is organized in the modern day, and perhaps might allow us to develop our image of science in a better way, in a way that's more relevant to the real world in all its political messiness. So a quick qualification. Obviously, I don't think that all models are bad. I'm not trying to argue against the use of models in general, but I'm saying by looking at a bit of the history and a bit of the purposes that these models were intended for originally, and looking at the way those intentions still inform contemporary modeling techniques, we can be more informed. We can assess things from a slightly different angle, in the discussions around the epistemic contribution that these models provide. So the implication, hopefully, is that we can perhaps temper some of the normative recommendations that are coming straight out of just direct computational modeling with insights from other areas of philosophy that perhaps are more friendly to the ideas from social and historical critique. Rather than having to reinforce or shore up the view that science is a purely independent epistemic authority. So yeah, thank you for listening. That's my lot. I know I've gone over a bit. Sorry about that, but look forward to any questions. Feel free to ask me anything. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthias. So we're now have time for questions. We can take questions over Zoom. Please raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, and we'll also take questions in person. If you have a question in person, please come to the front and use the microphone on the front desk here.
So Matthias, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes,
So
so.
you want to look at the camera.
Oh, okay. This is a little-
Other side of the desk and speak to the microphone.
Okay.
You'll see.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the talk. There are a few, so I don't work in this area, so I'm not completely familiar with the literature, but I had one question, which is whether the new models might be trying to give a better image of people as opposed to an image of science. So if there's an external way of motivating some of the assumptions about how people respond to the sort of incentive structures of their institutional setting, then that might give a sort of independent motivation that doesn't require building in this sort of picture of, that you're critical of, that Kitcher seemed to have as a motivation. So I'm wondering if that's one move that the modelers have made.
That's a very good, very good question. I do think that a lot of the support around these contemporary models is couched in terms of their ability to present a better picture of people than was available from the kind of Homo economicus neoclassical view. And that's definitely a reason that these models are better. I think, and I'm not trying to argue against the use of these models in general, but rather we can complement the conclusions that they're generating, and maybe try and understand how that image of science, which is still there despite the improved image of people, the representation of scientists is certainly more nuanced, more complex, but the image of science as a whole, which is carried over in the focus, in the emphasis, and in the kind of structural modeling assumptions, is still active. So I think what might be useful is just to incorporate these elements in the debate with these modelers, such that they can also themselves become aware of the ways in which their own models inherit certain features, even though obviously they're certainly able to generate more nuanced conclusions about the behavior of individuals. But as if we're serious about social epistemology involving social questions in a broader sense, then I think we should also discuss these features.
Any other questions?
I think I see someone in the
Lauren, go ahead.
chat.
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation, and I apologize for not having my camera on at the moment. My apologies.
No worries.
So I wanted to ask, you mentioned that you were interested more broadly in your research program about looking at the kind of social factors that impinge on the nature of scientific research. So I was wondering if you could take this as an opportunity to look at the kind of theoretical background that you presented here. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that relates to, say, tobacco companies' intervention in medical research or whatnot.
Okay, I'll try and think those two things together a bit. I haven't really explicitly tried to connect those things, so it's a really good question. I just thought to mention those things because I think, without being an explicit kind of premise in my argument, certainly those that kind of research informs my general approach somewhat. So I think it gets messy here. It gets complicated because in practice, and this came out in the debates, which some of you may be familiar with, in the 1990s, that have since been called the science wars between critical and constructivist academics, sociologists and historians, and scientists, who the scientists perceived the academics as launching critiques of scientific knowledge that were not really based on a sound understanding of the sciences that they were critiquing. And there's definitely a tendency to kind of obscure the differences between, how it feels for a physicist to be doing physics and how it feels for, a social scientist or even a nutrition scientist or an epidemiologist to be doing their work. Certain scientists are going to be much more conscious of the direct social factors impeding on their work than others. The reason I say it gets complicated is because the critics, some of the most vocal critics of scientific knowledge, have also been accused of providing fuel for climate skeptics and so on, in that by attacking scientific knowledge, they equip certain interested parties with arguments that can be turned against efforts to implement policy, for example, climate policy. Someone arguing against certain policy ideas might say, well, look, these sociologists, these historians have shown that scientific knowledge is not really, we can't really ever know that it's true. We can't really know that it's objective. It's always politically informed. It's always driven by political interests. And there it gets, you can see the difficulty. You want to incorporate social dimensions of science, but you don't want to undermine the idea that we should be implementing the results of good scientific research into government policy. So I think there's a lot of space here for more research and clarification and understanding of how we can develop our account of science such that it incorporates elements of the social and historical critique and elements that are, obvious to all when we see, for example, that the tobacco industry funded a huge amount of medical science that was involved in the effort to delay policy on smoking, distract from the questions linking smoking to cancer, and to generally undermine the idea that there was a consensus in the medical and expert community about the cause of lung cancer being one of the major causes being smoking. So I think there's useful thinking to be done there, and I certainly don't have the answer of how to develop a nuanced account, how to do science critique, if you like, in a way that's productive, but isn't going to play into the hands of people who are, ultimately cynically using generally accepted truths about science, like science is never really certain knowledge, and it's always up for revision and empirical, you know, iteration and so on. So it's a very good question for that reason. That's why it interests me, is how do we incorporate these critical elements while still remaining wise to the fact that, you know, if we're honest, most of the way modern science is funded and organized is like deeply integrated into structures of capitalism and political, you know, democratic institutions, and all those things are, you know, worth investigating, I think. But thank you for the questions.
Okay, we have another question in the room.
Hi. Okay. Okay, where should I look? Really? Okay. Thank you for your presentation. And just maybe a little thing on what you just said. You mentioned in your presentation at the end the standpoint theories and feminism of science, like theories, yeah, feminist theories of science. And I was wondering if that could be like maybe a starter to think of the question you were just answering now, but the fact that in any scientific approach, according to these theories, some values are already implicated. And so the first step towards like better science could then be to recognize that there are values at stake, and then if we start from there, considering that the objectivity is not this like need for neutrality or impartiality because it doesn't exist, but that like we have some values that we can recognize and then select or differentiate like between okay values and not okay values. I was wondering if you had more to say about these theories and their compatibility with the alternatives that you are looking at.
That's a very good question, and yeah, it speaks exactly to some of the initial thoughts I had when I first kind of became introduced to these modeling techniques, because it seemed like such a contrast to some of the other areas of philosophy that are very active now, philosophy of science, particularly the one you've alluded to, value ladenness as a general approach. And I think that's another great way of understanding, on one level, kind of the conflict or the incompatibility between approaches that we see between these normative models and some of the other kind of positions that are becoming prominent in the philosophy of science. So the value ladenness debates tend to hinge on the idea that even in perfectly good, you know, not corrupted or biased science, even in perfectly good by our normal methodological standards science, there is always value judgments at work, because scientists have to account for the risk that they might be wrong about anything, and scientists are probably generally more attuned to that than perhaps the average person, because they are aware always that, or at least we hope so, that the claim or the theory that they're using, the claim they're making, or the research conclusion that they've reached, or the data that they're using could be mistaken, something could be wrong, they could be interpreting it wrong, or so that involves a constant element of judgment in the process of science, whether it's selecting your research question, analyzing your data, communicating your results to others. That's obviously a big area where some element of judgment has to come in. How you present your level of epistemic certainty about a certain conclusion, that's obviously a huge debate in in medical philosophy and also climate science, where the strength of your belief in a certain conclusion might have a huge impact on how you're going to act in relation to that, or how policy might be built on that. So it's a very good way to, I think, start thinking about this, is to say, look, if that's true, that values do play this integral role in all of scientific thinking, then, you know, how can models be developed that incorporate that? Can we formalize moral judgments and risk assessments and value judgments in a computer model? Is that possible in a useful way? Maybe. I've certainly seen it argued in a recent paper that I forget the name of the author, but if anyone wants to follow up on this, just, you know, send me a message or something, regarding precisely in their view the incompatibility between value judgments and formal systems. And it's just a truth of the matter that some things are not easily amenable to formalization in a essentially a mechanical system. And I think that's a great place to start making progress in this. And yeah, thanks for the question.
Okay, so we still have time for maybe one more question.
Hello, thank you very much for your presentation. That was amazing.
Thank you.
My question's a little half-baked. I was particularly intrigued by the market-like analogies, and I was just wondering if you could elaborate on that, because when I think of the market, I think of the stock market, and I think of how it's influenced by supply and demand and imbalances. And I'm just wondering if there's any philosophical contributions or any philosophical thoughts in terms of epistemology and things like how you're talking about the issues in medical sciences and climate change. And I'm just wondering if you kind of touched on that, or if there are any thoughts or discussions in that aspect.
That's a great question. The use of market metaphors in either in the general applied or social sciences, or specifically in philosophy of science, is a topic that's seen a fair amount of debate. There was a very influential, or fairly widely known in this area, a paper I think in the mid-90s or early 90s by a guy called Wade Hands, called Caveat Emptor. And that was basically, his argument was essentially, we should be wary of importing these economic models into our philosophy of science, because if we look at the debates surrounding their use in economics, we can see that it's already vexed there. So if we bring it into science, or rather into our picture of scientific research and the epistemic debates, we're going to, we risk bringing over a whole bunch of baggage that we may not want in our account of science, depending on what we think about those economic debates. And just kind of a warning sort of thing. And yeah, I think it's particularly interesting, the market analogy in the context of contemporary economics, because, and this again is, I'm branching over to some of my other research, where I've become really interested in the history of neoliberalism, because in the kind of early days of the economic school that has become, especially since the late 70s, pretty much hegemonic in Western democracies, the kind of economic school we associate first with Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, and subsequent kind of IMF, World Bank type institutions that have carried out programs of economic austerity. And though that philosophy of economics associated with that thinking relied heavily on a reinterpretation of markets from being things that transferred resources, distributed resources efficiently, you know, in a situation of limited finite resources and a certain set of possible distributions. They reinterpreted what a market was, or particularly Hayek did, and the Chicago School of Economists in the kind of post-war period upwards to the 70s when they first became directly involved in policymaking, reinterpreted the market as an information processor, namely specifically as a tool that was best, what it was best at was distributing information in an optimal way and communicating, allowing market signals through the price mechanism to be transferred through market interactions. And that therefore, on that basis, markets became the kind of gold standard for a mode of organization. And that's on that basis, then you have the transition from you know, government organized or funded institutions and services to privately funded and organized institutions and services. So because the market is the best information processor that mankind has encountered, and because it knows better than any individual can know, we can therefore, it's, you know, it's allowed for this proliferation of markets as information processors throughout various modes of society. So I think because of that, it's really interesting that we then later on get these market analogies being made about science and in various other areas as well, to try and show that truth seeking is actually just like market behavior. It's almost like backwards, because it happened first in economics and then turned out, you know, they were already thinking that science was best managed by the leaders of the market, and that itself is tied to the way these different industries were then able to influence science because they were funding it. So yeah, it's all really interestingly interconnected, and thanks for asking about markets, because I could talk for ages about that, but I won't, because I don't want to eat into other people's time. So thanks very much.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question if there are. Yes, Dr. Froschen.
Thanks so much for the nice talk. I want to ask a question about possible implications from your conclusions. So I can imagine two different ways that you might want to go from on the basis of sort of this critique. And I'm curious if I'm right that those are two options here, which is the one that you're sort of, that you think you're inclined to move towards. So I can imagine one implication that you might draw from this kind of an analysis is something like, okay, this internalist accounting, as it were, of influences on where scientists distribute effort is sort of fine and good as far as it goes, but actually misses out on really important social determinants of scientific activity. So you've sort of told one tidy little bit of the story, but telling that part of the story doesn't mean there aren't other parts of the story. And in fact, those parts of the story might be important or more important to bring into our account. So I can imagine that being one direction. Another direction might be something like this kind of a neat internalist picture is just wrong because of what we know about social influences, what are sort of pretty clear accounts at this point of social influences on science. And so there isn't even this kind of tidy internal story to tell. So I'm curious if those two options make sense, if I'm right to see those as like the ways to go from here, and if so, which of those is the implication that you would like us to draw from this? Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very good question. That's exactly like the two kind of general options I found myself with at the end of this paper, thinking there's kind of a stronger argument here, and then there's a slightly more qualified one. As you said, if we just if we perhaps for independent reasons just think that that picture of science is wrong and we just want to abandon it, then, and of course that, you know, that itself is probably going to divide some people depending on their positions in various debates. But if you're sympathetic to that picture, namely that kind of classical position is just wrong, then I think the strength of this historical move, if you will, if you can call it that, is that the general response to those criticisms, which, as I kind of tried to discuss a bit at the start, but maybe glossed over slightly, general criticisms of that picture being wrong, and therefore, you know, usually couched in terms of this modeling, this model you have of science is just, it's inaccurate, right? That's the general form that argument's going to take, and it often involves, you know, targeting a specific model and saying, look, the picture of science that you get if you look at the modeling assumptions that you've made here is just wrong, and we should abandon, you know, we should look for some different method, look for a different way of arguing for a normative claim about how science should be done. I think the problem with going that route is that, as I found reading around this topic, is that generally when addressing the modelers in that way, and this is, I think, was also what happened in the case of philosophy of economic, those economic discussions, criticism of a particular model usually results in another model, if not several more models, where someone says, okay, well, yeah, I made that assumption here, but look, I can tweak my assumption very slightly and get a slightly different trend emerging in my simulation, or a slightly different set of analytic solutions to my equations. And I've incorporated your critique. My model is now more nuanced, and you kind of get this proliferation and ever increasing technicity or technical specificity in the philosophical debate, where there's a whole world of philosophical research that's highly like technical and basically just internal to the modelers and their different, like, increasingly complex and accurate modeling techniques. So I think the problem is precisely in the transfer between those that are sympathetic to the kind of position you outlined, where you just think this picture of science is wrong, and the people who are modeling, because they don't think, they may agree with you that the picture of science is wrong, but they still think there's some value that they can get from the model. There's still, you know, and the same arguments were made in economics, right? That these criticisms came out of, you know, across for many, many years about the accuracy of models. You know, people aren't rational, self-interested automatons who just make decisions on the basis of a set of preferences, trying to maximize their utility. Like, we all know that isn't how people work, but that didn't stop the modelers. You know, they just went on undeterred and produced more and more complex, you know, and they have like behavioral economics and like bounded rationality and all this stuff that tried to incorporate, oh, look, we can have a more complex and nuanced agent, all this stuff. So that's why I tried to move in a slightly different direction and say, look, okay, forget attacking a particular model for its accuracy. Let's just be really frank about why these models were introduced in the first place. And then you can see plainly what the work the model is supposed to be doing. And therefore you can then, you know, assess whether you think that that's a useful image to keep carrying forward of science. And I don't necessarily think that, you know, and the problem with the way models work, I guess, and the way the sheer diversity of philosophical questions in epistemology is that there might be areas where highly idealized simple models are really useful. And in fact, some of the modelers derive conclusions about scientific communities that are highly critical and show how susceptible to external influence a community of inquirers is under certain conditions. So it's, in a way, it kind of undermines itself as long as the modelers are willing to kind of look in certain directions at the possibility of external influence and so on and so forth. But it's very much up to the, up to the modeler to take those steps or to ignore them and to carry on. And so, yeah, it's an excellent question, and kind of, I think, comes down to your strategy, who you're trying to convince and argue against, and that sort of thing. But thank you for the question.
Okay, so let's thank Mathijs for his talk. Okay, so we'll now take a break. Those of you who are here in person, there's refreshments outside.